the court for its support today. It is so that you just heard recording in progress. We have a couple of hundred people zooming in from across the Ninth Circuit. So we'll have cameras. We've got tech people in the back, but hello to those that have signed on. And I wanted to thank the court. They are, of course, providing the space today, but they're also funding our wine and cheese reception, which will happen in the jury assembly room when we're done with this program. Now we have a lot of hands that came together to make today possible, and you're going to hear from those three organizations. And we would like to start now with the M. Margaret McEwen Federal Bar Association President, Mike Wampold. Mike.
Thank you, and thank you to Cynthia for all she does for the court. I'd like to have, on behalf of your Jewish Federal Bar Association president, welcome to Jewish Heritage Month. Very pleased to be celebrating this, and I just want to really thank Judge Lasnik and Mr. Siegel for coming to do this. It's really a treat, and we're very, very appreciative. So this is just an example of the kind of programming that the M3 Bar Association does. And we're so pleased to have all of you here in person, so many in person, and all of you online. So thank you so much. And with that, I'll hand it over to the other organizations.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Looking forward to a fascinating conversation today. My name is James Siegel. I'm with Davis Wright Tremaine. I'm here today on behalf of the Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society. We're very pleased to be collaborating once again with the M3 Federal Bar Association and for the first time with the Cardozo Society of Washington State. The mission of the NJCHS is to illuminate the fascinating history of the law in the Ninth Circuit and to promote the independence of the judiciary. We pursue that mission through three primary endeavors. First, through programming much like this. Second, through our journal, Western Legal History. And then third, by collecting and then publicizing oral histories of judges and prominent attorneys throughout the circuit. Please visit our website at njchs.org. That J is a little tricky, or at least it's tricky for me. It's njchs.org. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Arik Bomstick, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Cardozo Society, which is the official Jewish Minority Bar Association in the state of Washington. We are so honored that our co-sponsors reached out to us, and the U.S. District Court literally opened its home to help us celebrate Jewish American Heritage Month. Now, truth be told, the Jewish faith and people are full of ancient celebrations, but this is the first time that the Cardozo Society has celebrated Jewish American Heritage Month. And what a great idea. Celebrating all the ways that wonderful and complex that Jewish lawyers have contributed to this complex and wonderful profession and the country that Jewish lawyers call home. We are so grateful to be here with you. Thank you all for attending, to Judge Lasnik, to Martin Siegel, and we're gonna have a fascinating conversation today, and we're all looking forward to it. Thank you.
So can we have one more round of applause for all of our co-sponsors? So without further ado, one housekeeping item, and I know Judge Lasnik doesn't like me to use the word housekeeping, but I'm using it. If you want CLE credit today, even if you didn't register, you can still sign in. We just need your bar number, your name, and your signature. Those were on the sheets as you came in off the elevator out in the front lobby. Now for the conversation, I will turn it over with very minimal introduction to he who needs no introduction, our own Judge Lasnik.
Thank you so much. I may not need an introduction, but I asked Tracy Morris to whisper in my ear the names of everyone who I know I should know their names and have forgotten them at least temporarily. So please excuse me if I seemed a little befuddled there. But Martin Siegel has been here just overnight, and he's already spoken more words than Moses did. But he's very, very verbal and very, very interested. So two things, and he should be a Tony Walker, but he's not. He's from Houston, Texas, and still lives in Houston, Texas. But I give him honorary New Yorker status for sure. So we're going to discuss Judge Irving R. Kaufman. Now, Judge Irving R. Kaufman was not born Irving R. Kaufman. He was born Isidore, no middle name, Kaufman. That was not unusual. Both my parents, who were somewhat contemporaries of him, had no middle names. Unlike Isidore, they didn't take the middle name that he did, Robert, which he thought was such a traditional waspy name. And they didn't change their names from Kenneth and Ruth to something that sounded less Jewish, although I never really understood why Irving is less Jewish than Isidore. But the point is, we're going to be looking back predominantly at a trial that happened 74 years ago. Put that in a little historical perspective. 1951 to 2025. If someone were to write a book about what's happening right now, 74 years from now, it would be 2099 or 2100. So there's a lot of history that went into this book. And there's a lot of history that we need to reconjure up to get to an understanding of what was the world in America and internationally really like in 1951, when the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg occurred in the courtroom of Irving R. Kaufman. So that's a little bit of our assignment today. We're not going to limit ourselves to just the trial and the sentencing, but we're going to make that the focal point of what we're doing here. Oh, are we going to start, Cynthia, with Martin reading something from the book?
Yes.
Go ahead. Great.
Okay. You can hear me, right? Yeah, it's on? Okay. Thanks very much, Judge Lasnik. I really want to thank you for the interest you've taken in the book and for inviting me here. I want to thank the Bar Association and the Historical Society and the Cardozo Society. Thank you all for coming. This is a brief, I know all of you have read the book, of course, and bought several copies, but on the off chance that isn't true, this is a bit of the prologue and just kind of explains the larger impact and sort of legacy, I guess, of Judge Kaufman, a bit of why I got interested in it, and hopefully sets the table for our conversations. I don't want to read at you for too long, but so prologue, the funeral. On a freezing February morning, I left the tiny apartment I shared with an architect and his girlfriend near Washington Square and headed uptown. I was on a sad and surreal errand, my boss's funeral. He was a federal appellate judge on the bench for 40 years, and for the past 6 months, I'd been one of his 2 law clerks. Just out of law school, we analyzed cases for him, recommended how to rule, and wrote first drafts of the court's opinions. Heady stuff for 20-somethings still reeling from bar exams. But now we were filing past NYPD officers into the Moorish opulence of the Park Avenue Synagogue. We tipped around the dignitaries, former heads of the CIA and FBI, other judges, media bidwigs, and found seats in back. I don't remember much of the service. Mostly I was people watching. Then came the moment no one there will ever forget. The rabbi, a white-haired eminence, was winding up a soft-spoken eulogy when out of nowhere, someone behind me bellowed, "He murdered the Rosenbergs, let him rot in hell." For a split second, it felt as if a bomb had detonated. The elderly grandees gasped, ducked, lurched. I recovered in time to turn around and see an old, shabby figure calmly stride out of the sanctuary. The rabbi, a seasoned pro, recovered and went on. After the service, out there on Madison Avenue, 2 or 3 people were parading in a little circle holding signs, picketing in the icy cold. I was dumbstruck. Protesting a dead man from the grainy gray and white yesteryear of the McCarthy era? I was 25, and to me, they might as well have been screaming, "Remember the Maine." I couldn't believe actual living people still cared, still hated the man enough to find and infiltrate his funeral and hound him one last time, literally into the grave. Justice Felix Frankfurter once said that being forgotten is, quote, the fate of all but very, very few judges. At least my old boss, Irving Robert Kaufman, was one of the few. In 1951, Kaufman wrangled to get the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, charged with stealing the quote secret of the atomic bomb and handing it to the monstrous Joseph Stalin. He was 40, one of the youngest federal judges in America, and only 16 months in office. During the trial, he often intervened in ways that helped the government. Upstairs in his chambers, he conducted secret ex parte meetings with the prosecutors, including the infamous Roy Cohn. No one knows what they discussed. Once jurors convicted, he deftly advertised his anguish over the sentence and alluded to solitary soul searching in his empty, dimly lit synagogue. Quote, "I shall approach my task with deep humility," he'd written the president on his appointment. Quote, for to judge a man is almost a divine prerogative. Now the hour for judgment had come. But his lonely meditations didn't end in mercy. Instead, he condemned the young couple to die in the electric chair in Sing Sing and blasted them for nothing less than igniting the Korean War. Quote, "Who knows but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason," he thundered before a spellbound Manhattan courtroom. Carried out 2 years later, despite a frenzied push for clemency that united Picasso and the Pope, the death sentences convulsed America and ratcheted up Cold War tensions. By then, bomb threats had driven Kaufman and his family from their luxurious Park Avenue apartment. The septuagenarian zealots stalking his memorial service were missing something, though. In the years that followed the Rosenberg case, the hanging judge became something few who didn't know him predicted: a progressive stalwart. He was the first federal judge to desegregate a school north of the Mason-Dixon line. After President John F. Kennedy elevated him to the appellate bench, the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, then the second most important federal court in America, his opinions modernized the insanity defense, improved juvenile justice, reformed Attica-era prisons, and shielded conscientious objectors from the jungles of Vietnam. The grateful son of immigrants, he freed, quote, the man without a country, end quote, stranded on Ellis Island, and halted Richard Nixon's deportation of John Lennon on bogus drug charges. In a decision called the Brown versus Board of Education of Human Rights Law, he breathed life into a vague, dusty statute from 1789 and permitted victims to bring their foreign torturers to justice in American courtrooms. His greatest mark was on the First Amendment, as he championed the press and free speech in the Pentagon Papers case, a landmark libel suit against 60 Minutes, and other path-breaking decisions. Again and again, civil liberties lawyers would think of the martyred Rosenbergs and blanch on learning Kaufman was one of the 3 judges assigned to decide their appeal, only to turn ecstatic when he ruled in their favor. Grace withheld from the Rosenbergs overflowed toward others: the weak, the excluded, the unpopular. So the fierce living passion aroused that day by the old dead Irving Kaufman poses a riddle about judicial schizophrenia. How did the man responsible for 2 of the most infamous executions in American history become one of the most illustrious liberal jurists of his time? The question is what 2 historians called the enigma of the Rosenberg's judge, a figure typically but wrongly caricatured as nothing more than a bloodthirsty supporting cast member in the morality play of McCarthyism. Kaufman's clamorous send-off also reflected the wages of an extraordinarily tumultuous judicial life, one superheated. Is that better? There we go. Okay. And a superheated energy and frantic ambition. My entire career has been one dominated by a sense of urgency, he confided to a family member. In his first 4 decades, he rose from nothing to national hero. Most people thought the Rosenbergs got what they deserved, and newspapers and congressmen hailed his courage in defying communist bullying and lunatic death threats. Little seemed to block his path to the Jewish seat on the Supreme Court. But gradually, over the second 40 years, the terror of atomic annihilation and the red baiting dissipated, and a deferred and scornful howl went up over what had happened to the Rosenbergs. In the 1970s, the couple's orphan sons came of age and led a new generation's crusade to expose the government's asserted frame-up of their parents, charges made all too plausible by the stream of official lies in Vietnam and Watergate. When FBI records revealed Kaufman's private dealings with the prosecution, it was suddenly 1953 again. Dogged by new threats and strident protesters, denounced in print and faced with calls for impeachment, he lived under siege. His haunting by the eternally young couple bubbled to the surface in defensive outbursts to people he hardly knew, and in a relentless, decades-long secret campaign to counter and muzzle critics. I saw it in the sad, creased, oxidized brown index cards I found on his desk in 1991, quoting praise from the Rosenbergs' lawyer almost a half century earlier. Life in this pressure cooker exacted its bitter toll. One of Kaufman's sons was in the synagogue that morning to say farewell, but two were absent. They'd predeceased Kaufman after decades of substance abuse, paternal haranguing, and in one case, mental illness. Dominated by the husband she'd married at 19, Kaufman's wife, Helen, suffered her own travails: alcoholism, anorexia, and attempted suicide. Misery shadowed the family's gilded lives among New York's Jewish elite, and few in the know chalk that up to coincidence. For most who do it, judging offers one of life's quieter, cloistered pursuits. By and large, judges lead unspectacular lives, wrote one profiler of the revered Judge Learned Hand in 1946. Quote, their careers, like broad plateaus, are unmarked by gullies and hills. For Kaufman, however, the judicial calling formed a backdrop to heartache and collateral damage. What began as dazzling and precocious self-made success, a sprint toward the summit of legal power, ended largely in self-inflicted tragedy, just as the letter writers and the funeral picketers wanted. Despite judges' importance, our system seeks to anonymize them, from uniform black robes to Delphic pronouncements in legalese. Yet temperament and inner life are among the key forces that contribute to judicial outcomes, though almost all the attention usually goes to ideology or political background. As one legal philosopher said famously long ago, there is no guarantee of justice except the personality of the judge. Or as Kaufman himself put it, justice is administered by human beings. And Kaufman, the man, defiantly refused to recede into bureaucratic obscurity. Judges, especially appellate ones, are usually thought of as reactive, dispassionate, reserved, Olympian, contemplative. For better and worse, Kaufman was the opposite: active, hyper-energetic, combative, consumed with image, power-hungry. At a bantamweight 5 feet 4 inches, he disappeared into his leather-backed chair, leaving a head barely visible above the bench. His deep, loud, gravelly, heavily accented New York voice had to do the work, and it never failed to make itself heard. In court, the fleshy face with its broad and mashed up nose and curled down lower lip often formed what Roy Cohn called a, quote, intimidating leer. Until Gray emerged victorious in his 60s, his hair was thick and black and slicked back. He placed great stock in appearances, looking British and thinking Yiddish. And his dark three-piece suit was always well-tailored with cufflinks and pocket square to boot. To those squirming under his thumb, clerks, secretaries, lawyers who didn't measure up, he was tyrannical, a grenade waiting to explode. One ex-clerk I called said simply, quote, that was the worst year of my life and I don't want to talk about it. Another cried in the bathroom so often that when Kaufman learned where she was, he decided she must be drinking too much water and ordered water banned from chambers. As for her co-clerk, Kaufman raised himself up on tiptoes and shouted in his face so rabidly that the clerk thought to himself, I think I'm going to hit this guy, and wondered if that was a federal crime. That was when Kaufman was 80, after a triple bypass and a year from death. Before I even started, I heard about the time he got a call from security downstairs, after which he quietly put on his coat and left the office. A few minutes later, a marshal called back and was astonished that one of the clerks picked up the phone. Didn't the judge tell you about the bomb threat? The man asked. Of course he hadn't. Kaufman wanted them to keep grinding. Was that story true? Who knows? The point is, it was believable. Quote, fundamentally, he was not a nice person, end quote, an earlier clerk acknowledged. Yet Dr. Jekyll was there too, always. To friends and peers, he was affectionate and dependable. A few clerks adroitly navigated the tantrums and emerged close confidants with a powerful and eager backer in their corner. His eye could twinkle as he charmed listeners with jokes delivered with, quote, the polish of a Catskills comedian, end quote, as one former clerk put it. Gregarious and charismatic, when he thought it was worth the effort, he could and did seize the spotlight in rooms full of more prominent people. In 1977, a reporter assigned to profile Kaufman found herself defeated and eventually gave up, telling her editor, quote, I could not come to terms with all the ambivalent feelings Irving Kaufman provoked. A man with a devouring passion for publicity and one who also calls up a kind of sympathy for the raw nerves, the warmth that are also a part of him. This is the stuff from which novels are made, not Times Magazine pieces, end quote. Or as one anonymous lawyer summarized Kaufman for a guide to the federal judiciary, quote, he's courageous, outspoken, opinionated, articulate, usually right, and not much loved, end quote. Memoranda between judges at the Second Circuit were addressed to recipients using their initials. Kaufman was IRK or IRK. Everyone agreed it fit him perfectly.
story about the bomb threat and the clerk is my favorite. No matter what you think of how we judges treat law clerks, there's no way that one would ever happen. But I talked about going back to the earlier times, and it's very important that, especially out here, you get a feel for what it was like in New York City in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with the arrival of not the highbrow German Jews, but the real down-to-earth Yiddish, Eastern European, from Hungary, from Poland, refugees, basically, who were leaving countries where they were subjected to terrible pogroms and tons of discrimination. And in those days, this country was totally welcoming to those people. And they set up homes in the Lower East Side, working class. The parents didn't have educations. They didn't have very good jobs. But finally, they had an opportunity to give their children real and good, free education in quality high schools and colleges. And my parents were in that group. My mother went to a nice Brooklyn public high school and then on to Brooklyn College, and then got her master's in teaching at Columbia. My father went to a good boys' high school and then on to City College of New York. But Irving, or Isidore Kaufman, took a different road, didn't he? Tell us how he ended up at Fordham.
Sure, right. So his early life is exactly the kind of journey that you described. His family gets here in 1903. Of course, they speak English. They have $40 in their pocket. That's what the manifest on the ship says. It lists them $40 in their pocket. They end up on the Lower East Side. They then go to Jewish Harlem, which is a little kind of mecca for a while. Seems like an escape from the Lower East Side, and then that becomes overcrowded and deteriorates a bit. There's a great family story that I was told of Kaufman's mother sitting down, Kaufman and his two older brothers. And she says to the oldest, "You're going to be a doctor." And she turns to the middle one and says, "You're going to be a dentist." And she looks at Kaufman and says, "You like to talk, so you're going to be a lawyer." And that came perfectly true. Oldest brother was a doctor, middle brother was a dentist, and Kaufman became a lawyer. And he benefited absolutely from those great public schools you talked about. He went to DeWitt Clinton High School, which is huge, but to our minds today, the way I read about it, almost lavish sort of public institution that at that time was in Hell's Kitchen, later moved up to the Bronx. And he raced through school. He finishes high school at 16, and he enters a program at Fordham, which was a combined law school and undergraduate program. So he does 2 years of undergraduate and 3 years of law school. So let me talk about Fordham for a second, because that is different. Most kids went to CCNY, and really maybe the best thing I found in researching this was what the nickname for CCNY was at that time. It was so overwhelmingly Jewish that CCNY's nickname was Circumcised Citizens of New York. So it was a free, great education, and that's where most Jewish kids went. So why didn't Kaufman go there? Well, he didn't go there because his oldest brother, who wanted to be a doctor, thought the doctor didn't want to be yet another Jewish guy applying to med schools from CCNY. So he wanted a slightly different resume, which he thought would help him. So the oldest kid went to Fordham and really liked it. And so Kaufman went to Fordham. And that was a bit unique. Fordham back then was a more insular, so almost overwhelmingly, it was a Jesuit school, but almost the student body was almost exclusively Catholic. They have this campus up in the Bronx, which is beautiful and bucolic. And all the kids up in the Bronx, almost all were Irish Catholic and others who were Catholic. But Fordham, around the period of World War I, had figured out that this is a booming city with all kinds of new people in it, and we want to appeal to those people. And a lot of them are working during the day. We want to have a night school. And so it opened up this school at the Woolworth building in Lower Manhattan, where
tallest building.
Yeah, the tallest building at the time in New York. And it admitted not just Jewish kids, but Black students, a lot of women, because men are off fighting in World War I, so there are more women who were, they needed to keep the doors open. So it's a much more diverse and welcoming place that kind of symbolizes the new city. And that's where he went to school and got, so he said later, a fantastic education, and one that he was always grateful to the Jesuits of Fordham for giving him.
And one that he would sort of tell little white lies about in terms of who was the premier student.
He may have exaggerated, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Sometimes referred to himself as the top student. I looked at the list of graduating students and that doesn't seem to be him. It seems like he couldn't fully tell, but I don't think he was the top student.
Wasn't the last time he embellished
Yeah.
his reputation in any way.
He was a successful self-promoter.
So let's fast forward a little bit to the late 1930s, early 1940s. May 80 years ago, 1945, was Germany and the end of the European War. But one of our very close allies in World War II was the Soviet Union, right?
Yes, of course.
And we, of course, developed the atomic bomb. You all saw Oppenheimer, and you saw how Jews were very prominent in the development of the bomb, and Jews were very prominent in the American communist/socialist movement. And there were a lot of American Jews who were like, wait a minute, why are we not sharing the atomic secrets with our allies, the Soviets, the first ones to stand up to Hitler, to fight him in his attempt to take over parts of the Soviet Union? And why are we not being forthright with our allies? Of course, once the war ends, the Soviet Union is no longer our ally. It is now our mortal enemy. And things that happened when they were our ally are now looked at as espionage, if not treason. And tell the people about how this prosecution of the Rosenbergs came from this climate.
Sure. So it is hard to put yourself back in the mindset of New York and, of course, the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And the Soviet Union had transitioned from a wartime ally pretty quickly to a country with whom we had greater and greater tensions, and the Cold War begins to develop. And then in 1949, the Soviets explode their own atomic bomb, which was a shock to the American system, to the average American who assumed, and to even policymakers who weren't well versed in the technology, who assumed that the only way the Soviets could possibly, a country that we thought of as backwards almost, that had contributed to winning World War II, but with our know-how and with our equipment and really through their manpower. And so it was widely assumed that the Soviets could only have achieved that goal by stealing American secrets. Richard Nixon, very early in his political career, was someone who talked about this a lot in public. In fact, we, during the war, had broken the Soviets' code in an operation that is now called Venona.
Venona. Take a look at the Venona Project files. They are very interesting.
Right, and so that's a whole area of scholarship, certainly blown up since the end of the Soviet Union, where for a brief period in the 90s, a lot of those files became available to American researchers, and a lot of it was finally declassified in the United States. But at the time, of course, as you would expect, it was super secret. And through the Venona Project in the late 40s, American intelligence officials knew that the atomic program had been penetrated by spies. And so it set out to find those spies. And the first domino to fall, and by far the most important contributor through materials taken from the atomic bomb project and given over to the Soviets, was a German physicist named Klaus Fuchs. He was German, he was communist, anti-Nazi, had fled to England and worked in England, and then also worked in the United States. And you mentioned Oppenheimer. Klaus Fuchs has a sort of small cameo in the movie Oppenheimer. I kept waiting for like David Greenglass to be shown scuttling around somewhere, and they didn't do that. But Klaus Fuchs had been an important contributor to the American atomic effort. He was unmasked as a spy. He immediately confessed and cooperated with British intelligence, with American intelligence, told them about other figures in the espionage ring, and those figures were still in the United States. So the FBI begins knocking them off one by one. A man named Harry Gold, who'd been a courier in the Rosenberg scenario, David Greenglass. And Greenglass, of course, is the one who leads them to Julius and Ethel. Ethel Rosenberg is David Greenglass's sister. And there are other figures too. Some quietly flee the United States as these arrests are happening one by one, and they see what's happening. And the Rosenbergs and Greenglass intended to flee to Mexico. And in fact, their co-defendant, they were tried with a third person named Morton Sobel, who did succeed in getting to Mexico. And he was almost essentially kidnapped in Mexico and dumped back across the US border and sent back to New York for trial. So he was apprehended from Mexico. And so that's what sets the stage for this kind of spectacular trial. Kaufman had already presided before about 6 months or so before the Rosenberg trial. He'd presided over a smaller trial related to the Rosenberg episode of Miriam Moskowitz and Abraham Brothman, who were thought to be members of this spy ring, but the government didn't really have enough evidence against them for that. So they were charged with perjuring themselves in the grand jury, and they were convicted. They didn't take the stand in their own defense, not because they didn't want to reveal the secrets of the atomic bomb and the espionage that they knew, but because they were having an affair and they were married, and they didn't want that to come out in court. So they presented a particularly poor defense. They were convicted, and Judge Kaufman sentenced them to the maximum available sentence. And that set the stage for the Rosenberg trial a few months later.
And Judge Kaufman has been on the bench for 2 years now?
Fewer than 2 years, more like 18
And
months,
he
yeah.
was one of the youngest judges, federal judges in the country, but he wanted this case. And it seems that he manipulated the system to get the case assigned to him.
Yes,
doesn't
he very much did. So I don't know how it works here in the Western District of Washington. I assume that you have the same system that I remember as a AUSA in the Southern District of New York, which is a random, they wheel it out, they randomly assign a judge to you. In the Southern District at that time, the system was, they had a parts system. So a case did not live with one federal judge through its entire lifetime. It started with a motion part judge, and then it went to a different judge, and then there was something called the trial part. So it finally made its way over to a different judge who maybe was not at all familiar with the case, who would try the case. And that was open to great manipulation, because the government, if it wanted to get a certain judge, could just withhold the case until the judge it wanted was in the trial part. So there's some thought that the government did that. Roy Cohn described Kaufman reaching out to the clerk of the Southern District, and Roy Cohn lobbied the clerk to have Kaufman get it. And Kaufman could say legitimately, hey, I just presided over this related case. You know, it's easier. It's going to save the government and everybody time and energy because I know this stuff already. And, you know, I interviewed the last living member of the prosecution team and asked him, you know, he claimed not to know whether Kaufman had arranged his own appointment, but he did allow that the government was quite happy to get him when he was assigned.
And when I was growing up in Staten Island with my very Jewish mother, I was a huge New York Giants fan. And I would come to the breakfast table and say, Mom, Willie Mays hit a home run and the Giants won. And she would say to me, is that good for the Jews? Used to drive me crazy. But that was a mindset.
The only relevant question.
That was a mindset in those days,
Yes,
wasn't it?
Yes.
Whatever
yes.
happens, is that good for the Jews? Because
Yes.
there was always a worry that someone was going to turn on the Jews
Yes.
and say, you're not fit for being in this country, or you're socialists, or you're communists, or you're this, or you're that. And so that was something that while you had a segment of the American Jewish community that was socialist, maybe even communist, and very much sympathetic to the Soviet Union, you had another section of the American Jewish community that wanted to show, no, we're patriots, we're Americans, we're grateful to this country for what they gave us, and we will show everyone that Jews are just as loyal and just as patriotic as anyone else.
Yeah, well, I mean, the sort of Jewish element of this case really suffused it from the beginning, always kind of beneath the surface. Now, never spoken, but the judge was Jewish. The prosecutor, Roy Cohn, and the U.S. attorney at the time, Irving, they were Jewish. Obviously, the Rosenbergs were Jewish. The Rosenbergs had a background very similar to Irving Kaufman. Ethel Rosenberg had come from the Lower East Side. Julius Rosenberg came from Jewish Harlem. He was born right around the time the Kaufman family got to Jewish Harlem. They'd gone to CCNY. They just took a kind of different, but also very well-known route that a lot of Jews took that we know about in the 1930s, which is they became sympathetic to communism and became deeper and deeper involved, eventually became party members. So the case had all of these Jewish elements to it. Now, notably, there's one element of the judicial process I haven't mentioned. I've talked about the defendants, the judge, the prosecutors. What about the jury? No Jews on the jury.
Nobody wanted Jews on the jury.
And it seems that nobody wanted, it's hard to get at, why there's no rhyme or reason exactly to the strikes, but you can understand that Jews would be sort of unpredictable wild cards on a jury, right? What would they think? Maybe they'd have this shame or embarrassment over the Rosenbergs, as many, many Jews did in the United States. Or on the other hand, maybe they think they're being treated unfairly, scapegoated. Maybe they think the judge is being too hard on them because so you can't really predict it. And there were no Jews on the jury. And I know we're going to talk about some of the criticism of the case and the trial that began shortly after the convictions. And that was one consistent line of criticism that, in New York City, how do you get a case in New York City, with not a single Jew on this jury? But you also mentioned the kind of deeper, anxiety that American Jews felt at the time and felt over this case. Somebody I quote in the book is Arthur Miller, because he wrote a bit about this. And,
great playwright.
Yeah, the play, not the law professor, the playwright, Arthur Miller. He wrote, quote, "The anxiety in myself, to be candid about it, the worry and the chill of unquiet that there had been so many Jews noticeable in the left over the past decades. So I could understand the perhaps special need Jews could have, their very complicated desire to show that they too were patriotic Americans." And I think a lot of Jews felt that way. I'll just read one other thing. In the 1970s, there was a great article written by a journalist who did something no journalist in all the writing about the Rosenberg case, and there already had been a lot by then, no one had yet done, which is he went around New York and he found the jurors in the Rosenberg case in the early 70s. And they hadn't, 75, I think, they hadn't spoken out, any of those jurors. So he interviewed them and he got these, their memories, their reactions of it. And one of the jurors, as I said, none were Jewish, so this is a non-Jewish juror, said, is really kind of telling. He said, quote, "I felt good that this was strictly a Jewish show. It was Jew against Jew. It wasn't the Christians hanging the Jews. Any other judge would have been more lenient than Kaufman, but the Jews hated the Rosenbergs for the disgrace they brought upon their race." I love this amateur psychologizing from the juror. For the disgrace they had brought upon their race, Kaufman wanted to make an example of someone who would disgrace the Jewish people, end quote. And of course, that's a long-lasting, consistent line of criticism of Judge Kaufman and the supposition for why he was so harsh in the sentences.
So the case goes to trial. You haven't mentioned yet that the Rosenbergs also had Jewish defense lawyers.
That's right. I should have said that's right. Yeah.
And not just Jewish defense lawyers that you might see in the Chicago 7 trial who have a little chutzpah or like a Dershowitz or whatever.
Yeah.
You have a man who had done some criminal work, and then his father, who had never tried a criminal case in his life, is representing Ethel Rosenberg, while the son is representing Julius. And they really didn't mount separate defenses, even though Ethel had is it Edith?
Ethel.
Ethel.
Yeah.
Ethel had a much better defense if someone had made it for her.
Yeah. I mean, it's universally thought that the lawyers did a terrible job. And you mentioned they were not seasoned criminal defense lawyers. If you were on trial for your life for atomic espionage, you would want the best hard-boiled, experienced, tough criminal lawyer you could find. And instead, what the Rosenbergs had were Communist Party lawyers. And so there's also been a lot of conjecture over the years. Did the communists want them to win this case? Or were the communists actually quite happy with them losing and being martyrs for the communist cause? I interviewed Judge Kaufman's law clerk, who was there day after day in the trial. And he absolutely bought that theory. He thought that they were meant to lose. The lawyers did a stunningly poor job. and that none of that was really a surprise.
And it was the party that provided.
And it was the party that
lawyers.
provided. The Rosenbergs could not. One of them said later they lost their shirts trying to do it. They had no money, obviously. The lawyers, in their defense, they were greatly overmatched. The government understood the technology. The lawyers for the Rosenbergs got very little information from the government about it, didn't understand it. One of the junior members of that team recounted years later trying to get scientists who would talk to them and explain some of these principles about the bomb, the ones the government was willing to disclose in the course of the case. And no scientists would talk to them because they were pariahs for representing communists, and worse than that, communist spies. This lawyer said that they'd walk down the street near the courthouse in Manhattan, their old haunts, and left-wing lawyers they knew, old friends of theirs, would cross the street and not talk to them. So they were outgunned by the government. The government not only had the technical knowledge, they had a big team. They had a wide-ranging set of witnesses. The green glasses who could testify about the inner workings of this conspiracy. They had scientists who could explain the bomb. But beyond that, they also had some minor witnesses who it turned out, we know from this article in the 1970s, were very persuasive to jurors because they had no axe to grind. For example, Julius Rosenberg's doctor. Rosenberg went to him at some point and said, "Hey, we're going to take a trip to Mexico," and asked about immunizations and inoculations to go to Mexico. They had a passport photographer right down there by the courthouse. The Rosenbergs had tried to get passports and said, "We're taking a trip to France." Their maid testified against them about something that had come into the household that Greenglass said had to do with the espionage. So they had these minor witnesses who seemed to confirm parts of the Rosenberg story. They had other couriers in the case. Against all of that, and not understanding the case very well, the lawyers, the Blocks, this father and son team, only had the Rosenbergs themselves to testify.
And the Rosenbergs were not going to be good witnesses.
Yes, by all accounts, the jury hated the Rosenberg. They were not good and convincing witnesses because they just gave these kind of stone-faced denials. And ultimately, if you're the Rosenbergs, what you had to do was try to explain why, for Ethel, and Julius is a brother-in-law, why is my family member putting me in this capital crime, of espionage? Like that's remarkable. And you need some motive for that, or something that would make sense to jurors as to how this could have come about in a family. And the Rosenbergs had no such explanation. Of course, when David Greenglass was giving this testimony implicating his brother-in-law and sister, he was sending himself to prison for 30 years.
But he was also protecting his wife.
Yes,
from
yes.
prosecution.
He was
so
protecting
he
his
did
own
have
wife.
a motive to lie, and in fact, he did lie, didn't he?
He did lie. We now know that his testimony about Ethel, and this was the only real evidence that put Ethel in the conspiracy, was that she typed up notes that had been brought from Los Alamos so that they would be legible and understandable to the Russians before Julius handed them off to a courier. They had no evidence against Ethel. And so, and in fact, in the grand jury, David Greenglass said nothing about Ethel because the likelihood is his own wife typed up the notes. He later said he didn't really remember. But on the eve of trial, they needed evidence against Ethel, who they probably had been arrested really just as a lever to get Julius to confess.
And if she had done anything to reveal what was going on, she probably wouldn't have even been charged.
Yes, there's no question. Julius would have been charged, of course, and convicted. Yes. But right, it was hoped that Ethel would be like Ruth Greenglass, David Greenglass's wife, and provide evidence of the conspiracy, provide the names of other people who were involved, give more information about the data that was given to the Russians. And what the government didn't really wager on was both Rosenbergs immediately clamming up, steadfastly and adamantly maintaining their innocence until the very, very end. And I quote in the book, William Rogers, I think it was Rogers who later became Secretary of State, was involved in the government's team as the sort of executions were approaching. They kept trying, even at the last hour, they kept trying to get the Rosenbergs to confess, literally as they were walking into the chamber where the electric chair was in Sing Sing. They had telegraphs and wires set up, wired into Washington to stop the executions at any moment. They asked Julius a series of questions as he was preparing to walk in and be executed. And one of those, they had the script. And one of the questions was, did your wife know of your activities? Of course, his wife, who's been convicted of those activities, is about to be executed herself. So it's astonishing. It shows that really, in the end, the government didn't really know, how accurate its information was or what she had done. And I mentioned William Rogers, what he said, I think it was Rogers and maybe McInerney, I forget who said this.
Rogers.
At the end, he said, they called our bluff. She called our bluff. There was an element of this that was bluffing to get them to confess so that we could learn more about this espionage ring. And they refused to do that. They were diehard committed communists. And I think they themselves sensed the opportunity of being martyrs for the cause, of having something greater to have lived for.
But they were also parents of 2 young boys. And there was a feeling in the government that how could the mom be so callous as to not confess and be there for her children? She's no mother. In fact, she's controlling Julius. She's the bad person. She's the dominant person. She's the evil woman.
Yeah, you see that that comes through in Kaufman's sentencing speech. You see it in some of the memoranda. Actually, President Eisenhower, in a letter to, I think it was his brother or his son, I forget who, privately said that when, of course, a clemency petition went to the Eisenhower administration.
2 presidents turned down the clemency. First
Truman
and then Eisenhower.
Exactly. And there was this belief, since there was not a great deal of hard evidence against her, I think the world needed to kind of fasten on her some sort of guilt or an explanation for what was about to happen. And there was this sort of sexist perception that she must be the mastermind here. She was older, she was controlling. David Greenglass was her younger brother, and Greenglass looked up to her and looked up to Julius. And there was also a stereotype about communist women in general and communist wives. There was writing about that. Ethel was called in one newspaper article a red spider queen. This was true also of Hiss's wife. Alger Hiss's wife was attacked, even though she wasn't really directly involved, but it was thought that Alger Hiss's wife had also manipulated him. So it was a kind of stereotype, and she really paid the price for that, in part because her lawyer so ineffectively did anything to dispel it.
Now, Judge Kaufman had a long-term friendship with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah.
But Hoover actually did not support execution for Ethel.
Right. Hoover, not because he had any love lost for Ethel Rosenberg, but Hoover did think that it would look bad to execute a woman. That was to the degree that people hesitated, including Kaufman himself. It seems to be just the optics of we're orphaning 2 kids, we're executing a woman, which certainly happened in the state system, but was rare. And that's what gave Hoover pause. And in the end, Kaufman, wasn't enough of a deterrent for him.
So the trial proceeds, and Judge Kaufman is the most active questioner from the bench that I have ever seen. But most of his questions are during the defense presentation, and they sort of seem to undercut whatever defense was trying to be provided.
Right. So, I mean, to read the Rosenberg transcripts is eye-opening. You see that the judge is talking a lot on the record, more than I'm familiar with as a lawyer. As a lawyer who's tried some cases, more than you usually see. And almost always those interventions seem to be calculated to help the prosecution. So, for example, when David Greenglass testified that Ethel typed the notes, which was the first mention of that and of the thing that would be the active part she played in the conspiracy, the legal thing you need to give her a role, Kaufman immediately stopped him and had him repeat it, which seems calculated to have emphasized that in the eyes of the jury. When the Rosenberg's lawyers were cross-examining government witnesses, Kaufman would often cut in and say something if they scored a small point, he'd rehabilitate the witness in some way. When Ethel and Julius were testifying, he would sometimes cut in and ask his own questions. So he appears on the record a lot. And I think the fairest reading, and I think the consensus of people who've read it and other accounts of the trial you'll find, is that it seems like his goal was to help the government. Now, I have to say, to be fair, the Rosenbergs did make this a primary point in their appeal, and they appended to their brief all of these episodes on the transcript. They moved for a mistrial as it was happening. Of course, Kaufman denied that. And the Rosenbergs did get a very good panel in the Second Circuit, the kind of about the best panel you could hope to get. Long-time judges, Swan was on the panel, Chase was on the panel, and Jerome Frank. who's very liberal, New Deal, architect, had written about psychology and the law. So
Pardon, defense counsel gets up in closing and says, Judge, thank you so much for providing a totally fair trial and for
Right.
always treating
Right.
my clients and me with so much
Yes.
respect, et cetera. Talk about giving it away.
Giving it away. And so Emmanuel Block did say that. He praised Judge Kaufman, his conduct of the trial. He probably thought, well, this is just an innocuous thing to say. Maybe he thought this was before sentencing. So maybe he was trying to curry favor with the judge before sentencing. He could not have foreseen that those comments would appear in every single appellate brief written by the government, in every article years later defending his conduct. When I mentioned in the prologue seeing these ancient index cards on Judge Kaufman's desk in 1991, it was those comments.
40 years later.
40 years later, I was just stunning to me to see that in actual history sitting there on his desk. So just to come back to it, they did get a good appellate panel. The Court of Appeals did consider that point and did reject it and did say, well, yes, a judge is allowed to ask questions, and we can't see any reason that's biased as to why he's asking these questions. So on the Supreme Court, Justice Black thought that was inappropriate, and he was ready to reverse the convictions on that basis, and nobody else was in that court. So you can look at that, two ways. To me, it does seem like he was biased in those interventions.
And the defense never objected to those.
No, no. The defense was cowed by him, and that comment at the end that was so easy to put in a block quote in an appellate brief wasn't the only time that the defense, they're back on their heels, and the government lawyers, Cohn and Sapol, were barely cordial to them at all, and they just were backpedaling the whole time.
Yeah, you made reference to the ex-parte contact.
Yeah,
but that was more than just one phone call.
Oh, yeah.
Or one visit.
Yes.
Roy Cohn, who's still influencing our lives 74 years later,
beyond the grave,
was a young, brilliant Jewish lawyer who, at a very young age, was given this extraordinarily important case and had a constant pipeline going with the judge.
Yes. So Roy, it's interesting to talk for a second about Roy Cohn's background. In some ways, it mirrors Judge Kaufman's, except he didn't come from the privation that Kaufman did. Roy Cohn came from this family of political fixers. His dad was like a lieutenant to the boss, Ed Flynn, of the Bronx Machine in New York. And by all accounts, Roy Cohn was this crazy, brilliant, precocious kid who could recite the preamble to the Constitution at age 5. Everybody in that wealthy Upper East Side circle thought he was going to be the first Jewish president. Like Kaufman, he finishes law school early, too young to take the bar.
He needs to be 21 to take the bar.
So the same thing had happened to Kaufman. So he has to sit around and cool his heels. And almost immediately, though, but through his father's connections, as soon as he does pass the bar, he gets into the U.S. Attorney's Office. So he's only 22 or 23 or something. He's a new AUSA. Every other AUSA is sort of operating normally and working on their cases. Roy Cohn knew all the judges in the courthouse because half of them owed some degree of their appointment to his father. So he'd go around and he'd go into chambers and shake hands with judges and meet them and sit down and kibitz with them. He was a publicity, there's a quote in the book of one of his fellow prosecutors bitterly saying, Roy Cohn would indict someone in the morning, issue a press release, re-indict the guy in the afternoon, issue a second press release. He was seen as the publicity hound that he was. But he was brilliant, and Kaufman was a bit of a patron to him, although he had lots of patrons in this world of powerful New York men. And he met with Kaufman, if not every day after the trial, most of the time. That happened in two ways. He would go up to chambers, and so I interviewed, as I said, Judge Kaufman's law clerk who had known Roy Cohn at Columbia Law School, and he told me they would sit in chambers and talk. And Cohn famously would use the phone in the courtroom and would call Kaufman when Kaufman was at home. So they were in constant communication.
Some of those conversations were actually overheard by the FBI?
Well, so there's the Rosenberg's sons told me a story of, so I don't know if this is true, but they told me a story of much later encountering the son of an FBI agent who had been assigned in 1951 to watch over Roy Cohn. So the government's people already recognize that Roy Cohn is slippery and needs to be watched over. And this guy who then talked to the Rosenberg's kids was the son of that agent who said that when he was 12 or 13, he would sit around and his dad was playing poker with other agents. And he remembers his dad talking to the other agents about Roy Cohn on the phone with Judge Kaufman during the trial. But there's no doubt that these contacts happened. It's impossible to know exactly what was said. The U.S. Attorney himself, Sapol, participated in some or all of them. And, it could have just been the kind of logistics of, hey, tomorrow we're going to have this witness come and, kind of briefing him on what was coming up, or it could have been much worse. Any way you slice it, it shouldn't have happened. It was clearly against ethical rules. Even then, although Roy Cohn's defense in his autobiography was, oh, everybody did this.
Right. And when it comes to light in the 70s, there's a movement, there's even talk of impeaching Kaufman or getting him accused of some sort of ethical violation. And the bar associations circle the wagons to defend him.
Yes, very much so. So by that time, Judge Kaufman was a chief judge of the Second Circuit. And this controversy, which was so intense at the time of the executions, there were protests all around the country, really all around the world at the time of the executions. It died down over the years, as you'd expect. It sort of roars back to life in the early 1970s for lots of reasons. But probably the main one is that the Rosenberg sons come of age. They had taken the name of the person who raised them after their parents were executed, Abel Meerpole. So it was Michael and Robert Meerpole. They're alive today. And they had always been quiet about their parents' background for the obvious reasons. It's the 1950s, 1960s. They told almost no one who their real parents were. But by the early 70s, they were ready to go public and to make a crusade of clearing their parents' names and showing that their parents were, in their view, framed. And so that committees are formed around the country, articles and books are written, there was even a play written, and the controversy kind of comes back to life in part because there's a new generation of people who, in a way that wasn't possible in the early 50s, are now willing to believe the idea that the government would frame somebody as part of its crusade against communism.
Sure, we got civil rights, we got the Chicago 7, we got the Vietnam War, we got so much happening.
We got Watergate. It's the idea that the government would lie to people, which would have been a harder sell in the early 1950s, at least for the average American, is much more current in the culture. And the Rosenbergs are articulate and persuasive advocates for their parents' cause. And as I said, books have been written dissecting the evidence, suggesting maybe they had been framed. So leading up to your mention of the ex parte contacts, eventually the Rosenbergs file a FOIA request. And there had just been some amendments to FOIA that made it easier to get government information. Also helped a lot that J. Edgar Hoover had just died. So the FBI is under new administration that's a little less, connected to this and a little less determined to staunchly defend the outcome, as Irving Kaufman certainly was even then. And so a lot of information, thousands of pages of documents are released. I forget if it's Robert or Michael was on a speaking tour for the paperback version of their first book about the case. And his lawyer calls him and says, you got to get back to New York and see these documents. We're going to hold a press conference. Because the thing that jumped out of the documents, which were heavily redacted and hard to follow, was that these ex parte communications had taken place. And that takes it from a thing people are protesting as a Cold War injustice to a real firestorm of judicial impropriety and suggestions of hearings, suggestions of impeachment. And suddenly for Judge Kaufman, it really blew up this desperately and carefully cultivated reputation he had tried to amass in the years since the case of putting that behind him and being a sort of progressive stalwart.
Let's turn the clock back to 1951. The Rosenbergs were guilty of espionage.
He was
for sure. And maybe she was an accomplice, hard to say.
Yes.
But when the jury returns the verdict of guilty, how much time between that and the sentencing does Judge Kaufman give?
So he gave himself a week. One
week.
Right. And it's an earlier, like these days, sentencing is much, I mean, I'm not a criminal lawyer, but the sentencing apparatus is much more formalized, and there are things there's an office that prepares a pre-sentence report. There are things that happen along the way that's a much more elaborate procedure before a judge would have before him or her what would you normally see before sentencing. Like, none of that is true in 1951. It's entirely ad hoc. He can go talk to whoever he wants. He can have ex parte there's no question the rules allowed him to have ex parte communications then. And in fact, he met with the Green Glass family right before he issued his decision privately in his chambers. He met with, he tried to get the government's views. That turned out to be a muddle of disagreement at Main Justice and in New York.
When you say he met with the Green Glass family, he met with her mother.
Yes, Tessie. Yeah, Green Glass, right. The mother of David and Ethel. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she mostly spent her time, it seems, advocating for David because she had this rupture with Ethel and Ethel was a communist, which she didn't approve of, it seems. So, whereas David at least had confessed and admitted. So, and Ethel had not seen her mother while she was in prison. So it was this kind
But
of
Martin, this is also a crime that does not have a mandatory death sentence.
Yes.
It's a crime that says the punishment is imprisonment of up to 30 years or death.
Yes.
And so giving the lawyers 1 week to come up with why you should do 30 years instead of death doesn't seem right under any generation of lawyering and judging.
Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what was common then. I certainly agree. It seems way too fast. I don't know what the Rosenberg's lawyers, it's funny, they were thoroughly incompetent at trial when it came to trying to poke holes in a case and mount any kind of separate defense for Ethel or present reasons to the jury why this might be happening. I think their speeches to the court about sentencing, and I say speeches because one happened right before they were sentenced, and then again, in the end of 1952, there was a motion for him to reconsider sentence. So Emanuel Bloch was back making the same plea. Those are eloquent humanitarians, sorts of requests and pleas for mercies. It's touching on all the things you might suspect: the fact that Russia had been an ally, the fact that the world situation might change again, the fact that the Rosenbergs are parents, and so on.
But another thing that the lawyers missed is a really credible legal argument
yes,
that they never should have been subject to a death penalty because they did not commit treason. And when they gave secrets to a foreign power, that foreign power was our ally, not our enemy. And if you look at the clemency lawyers in the Department of Justice who looked at a later request to consider this that came from other outside counsel, there's a pretty good argument that was waived because it was never raised that the law should not have applied, and
right.
They were prosecuted under the wrong statute.
Right. So the 1917 Espionage Act, which is what they were prosecuted under, that would have criminalized giving secret information even to an ally. That the text of that statute says any foreign country. Now, and the Rosenbergs tried to argue that you shouldn't be treating Russia the same way as as they were a wartime ally, but technically under the statute they were covered. But what you're referring to is in the 11th hour, shortly before the executions, a couple of months or so before the executions, a completely different set of lawyers with no formal duty or retention, duty to retention by the Rosenbergs, appears as next friends of the Rosenbergs to make a completely different and new legal argument that had never been made in the case, which was that the 1917 Espionage Act didn't apply at all, and in fact had been superseded by the Atomic Energy Act, which would have made a difference in a couple of ways. First of all, you had to give it to an enemy. And secondly, a jury would have been required to impose the death penalty, and it couldn't have been imposed by a judge. And so it was a very good legal argument that the Rosenbergs lawyers had never uncovered and didn't know and had never raised. Even when it came to light, when the lawyers who unearthed it and wanted to make it first found it, they went to the Rosenbergs lawyers and they were kind of brushed off by them. So they had to show up alone and try to make this argument. Ultimately, some members of the Supreme Court accepted it. It's a sort of convoluted history how it very quickly got to the Supreme Court. Justice Douglas accepted it. Justice Black accepted it. Justice Frankfurter he dissented ultimately. It's unclear why. May have accepted it. So it was quite a valid argument that might have gotten traction had it been made earlier.
So the 1 week passes by. The government doesn't make a request for the death sentence. And Judge Kaufman says that's very appropriate. This is totally my call, and
right.
I don't really want to hear from the government. BS.
Yeah, he lied about that. So he had asked Irving Sapol, the U.S. attorney, what's the government's recommendation? Bizarrely, Sapol didn't have anything to say. Hadn't talked to people in Washington, didn't have a recommendation to give. Immediately, this is, I think, 2 days before the actual sentence is going to be issued in open court. Sapol flies to Washington, finds, Hoover thinks one thing, the attorney general thinks another, the deputy attorney general thinks a third. They can't reach agreement. Sapol reports that back to Kaufman, but now Kaufman's in a bit of a pickle because he doesn't want to be out there on a limb, sentencing them to death if the government can't even unanimously recommend that as a sentence. And so he invents this story that he had never asked the government for a recommendation because, as he said at the sentencing, hearing, the responsibility is so grave, I feel I should take it on myself. Which is, any lawyer reading that, you laugh out loud, like of course you asked. That you can't imagine, issuing a sentence without even knowing what the government requests. So the idea that a judge wouldn't ask, especially in a capital case of espionage, is absurd. But that's what he said on the record, and it was a lie to cover up the fact that the government couldn't make a decision.
And he did consult a higher power, though, didn't he?
He did. Yes, he let it be known. This appears in news articles at the time, so it really could only come from him. He let it be known that he'd gone to his synagogue, the Park Avenue synagogue, and had sat alone in the dimly lit pews to wrestle with his conscience and decide what to do. And I don't know if that ever happened. He was not a particularly religious person. He did believe in God. It's possible that occurred, but of course, whether it occurred or not is sort of secondary to his need to advertise his piety.
And what did
to the world.
Justice Felix Frankfurter say about
so
that?
that really disgusted Felix Frankfurter, who wrote in a letter to Irving, to Learned Hand, I despise a judge who would claim that God told him to impose a death sentence. He also said, because it was already clear Kaufman was angling for the Jewish seat on the court, which Frankfurter happily occupied. He also said, I'm old enough and mean enough to stay here so that Kaufman will be too old to succeed me. That did not succeed. Kaufman didn't succeed him, but it was not because Frankfurter shut him out. He died before he could do that.
The other thing about the type of Jew that Judge Kaufman was he would have his limousine drop him 2 blocks from the temple so he could then walk to temple like a holy Jew.
Like he had forever, he parlayed his, quite accurately, years of being threatened by people out in the world over the case. And there was a time when he very much did need FBI protection, but even when that faded, he was close to Hoover and others in the FBI. So he maintained the FBI as a kind of fancy driver service. Basically, he once asked an FBI agent to babysit his kids, and that generated a memo saying, like, I don't really think this is appropriate. I shouldn't have to babysit the judge's kids. But he did get them to drive him around, and there was an FBI driver, and yeah, he would be dropped off close enough to the synagogue so it appeared he was walking into Shul, but was not doing so.
But let's be clear that even when the Rosenbergs are executed in 1953, Gallup poll showed 76% of the Americans approved of that happening.
He was the case made him a national hero. He was, because he was quite adroit in using his connections in the press to have profiles written and to tell the world what pressure he was under, the bomb threats and the intimidation campaign and the letters. The image of him, to the country was that he had steadfastly resisted communist pressure, had stepped up and done the right thing, even at great cost to his family, potentially his family's security and his own peace of mind.
The other thing,
he was here.
We talk about threats to judges now, and Judge Kaufman had a series of serious bomb threats and threats to kill his family, and that left a toll on the Kaufman family for sure.
It really did. I wish I could find some, because since this is a sort of Jewish event and it's Jewish Heritage Month, it's worth noting a lot of those threats were mentioned his Jewishness. One of them said the Jews will get you because you're killing one of their own. They're just attacks on him because he was a Jew. That appeared repeatedly.
But also
he was subject to.
There was that anti-communism of the McCarthy era was in full bloom by 1953. And you talk about an Ohio senator on the same day as the verdict, so that's 1951, proposed that Congress investigate federal judges handling cases involving communists in light of their supposed lenience. I don't believe the courts of our country are sacred cows.
Right.
So if you think this never happened before, it clearly did happen in 1951.
Absolutely.
That federal judges were subject to threats for not being tough enough on fill in the gap. Sometimes communists, sometimes immigrants, sometimes whatever the boogeyman of the day is.
This had specifically happened in the Hiss trial because another Judge Kaufman, the sort of forgotten by history guy named Samuel Kaufman, no relation to Irving, was a district judge who presided in the Alger Hiss perjury trial. And that went through 2 trials because in the first trial, there was a hung jury and the press fixated on the judge and thought the judge had not been tough enough on the defense, had not issued the right rulings. Frankfurter came and testified as a character witness for Alger Hiss. And when Frankfurter showed up in court to testify for Alger Hiss, the judge, Samuel Kaufman, came down off the bench and warmly greeted Felix Frankfurter, as you might expect a district judge would if a Supreme Court justice is in their courtroom. But the world perceived it as an endorsement by the judge of this guy testifying on behalf of Hiss. And so he was pilloried. Samuel Kaufman was pilloried for being weak and unable to sort of do what a judge is supposed to do. I'm certain, I've never found a scrap of paper that said so, but I'm certain that experience affected Judge Kaufman, the Kaufman we're talking about here today. I think the other experience right around that time, speaking of judges under pressure, that would have affected him is that there had been a trial of the top Communist Party leaders in that same courthouse shortly before the Rosenberg trial. The judge who presided over that was a guy named Harold Medina. And that trial, like the Chicago 7 trial, which you've mentioned a couple times, degenerated into a circus because the Communist Party lawyers who represented those Communist Party leaders tried to put, just as the Chicago 7 lawyers did later, tried to put the system on trial. And they yelled at the judge and obstructed the proceedings and had these explosions in court. And Medina had no way, he couldn't control it, became more and more angry. The trial dragged on for 10 months. But in the end, they were convicted and Medina threw the book at them. And then he held the lawyers in contempt for their crazy conduct. And the world lionized Medina. Medina quickly got a promotion to the Second Circuit. And there was a fawning biography written of him. The best thing I ran across was that Medina, North Dakota, changed its name to Medina to honor this nationally famous judge, Harold Medina, who those among you who may know, then had a long career on the Second Circuit. And so I do think when Kaufman went into this case with all the pressure, public thinking about judges and communists, I think that had to be in his head, all of that stuff.
So, Martin, we do want to give some attention to the years afterwards,
right?
Where some people have said Judge Kaufman changed from pro-government to anti-government, or his eyes opened to more liberal points of view. The children of the Rosenbergs don't buy that. They figured that was all part and parcel of being a Truman liberal in those days. You were strong on national defense, you were strong on anti-communism, but you were open to civil liberties and things like that.
Yeah.
Do you think there was a transition in Judge Kaufman?
Yeah, I do. A little bit of a transition. I'm glad, and I do want to talk about it. So we spent a lot of time talking about the Rosenbergs. When I've done readings and appearances for the book, it always goes exactly like this. It's like 50 minutes about the Rosenbergs and 5 minutes about the rest of his career, which of course is totally understandable, and I respect that. I will say, I didn't write the book about, I wanted to, the thing that interested me about Judge Kaufman primarily was the rest of his career, because there have been a lot of books about the Rosenberg case. And I thought when I was writing this one, the world doesn't necessarily need another book about the Rosenberg case. It's more, for me, what was interesting about Judge Kaufman was that, of course, but also how did that affect the rest of his life and the rest of his career? And that career was quite prolific. It made him famous in the country. He's almost like a Zelig figure, or he had his hand in all these famous cases: the Pentagon Papers case, the first school desegregation case in the North, a famous mob trial, the Appalachian mobsters in the late 1950s, and starting from his time, especially on the Second Circuit, going into the 70s and 80s, he was a consistently liberal judge who was an ardent advocate of habeas corpus at a time. Even when judicial conservatism was resisting federal review of state convictions, he issued orders improving conditions in prisons. He is maybe his most famous case is a case called Filartiga, where he almost single-handedly invented international human rights law, taking the 1789 Alien Tort Statute and making that a vehicle for Americans to bring suits in U.S. courts for cases that seem to have no business being in the U.S. And Filartiga was about a person tortured in a foreign country in Paraguay who was suing his torturer, another Paraguayan, in a courthouse in New York. Kaufman allowed that. And of course, he was an ardent champion of press freedom. So there was this later prominent, to my mind, giving away my own predilections, admirable liberal career on the bench. And the thing that was always said about him was, well, this is all just kind of fake. He's atoning, for the Rosenberg case. I don't think that is true. I think he was a Truman liberal in the sense that, yes, he was strongly anti-communist and he was a protege of Hoover, and he'd gone to Fordham, which was a very conservative institution in those days. So he had sort of particular things that made him staunchly anti-communist. But the evolution that I talk about in the book, and the sense in which, to answer your question, I think he changed, is that he began as a sort of state-oriented liberal, a statist liberal, which I think is in line with how the Roosevelt administration and the Truman administration sort of saw the world. And then by the time we get into the 60s and the 70s, and it's the Warren Court era, liberalism is now not really aligned with the state. It's on behalf of the gadflies and others, civil rights plaintiffs and prisoners and people who are suing the state. And earlier in his career, Kaufman was almost entirely deferential to the government, certainly in securities-related cases like the Rosenberg, and there were others, but even in ordinary criminal cases. But later, he was willing to find that the FBI had broken the law. He was willing to vote against, in one case, a case involving the CIA, actually. He finally sort of gained the kind of stature and independence of mind that enabled him to be something other than a kind of cog in the government's machine for convicting people, which I think is what he started out as.
But he never expressed any regret over the Rosenberg case.
Sort of, he did. Never publicly. He defended his conduct in the case and the outcome in the case ferociously to the very end. He very sort of cleverly and with sophistication used surrogates, whether it was the FBI or Simon Rifkin. Recently, the firm Paul Weiss has been in the news a lot. Well, that firm was Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton and Garrison. Simon Rifkin had been a famous federal judge, as many of you here know, and a lead named partner in that firm. He was Kaufman's best friend, and he was kind of Kaufman's defender out in the world. And they were always working together to counter criticism. If there was a nasty thing about Kaufman said in an article, Rifkin would follow up with a letter to the editor, or he'd write an op-ed. Or in one case, there was a play that opened in Cleveland about the Rosenberg case, and it came to Kaufman's attention, and he was furious, and he called Hoover, and he's like, get some agents over there. And the next day, there was an agent watching that performance so that they could, complain about that. So he defended his conduct to the end. That's true. The only chink in the armor that I really found later in his life came to me from a clerk who worked for Kaufman right in 1977 at a time, sort of the most difficult and tragic time for Judge Kaufman, because his oldest son died suddenly and unexpectedly. His oldest son was around 40, around the same age as Ethel Rosenberg when she died, actually. And as you would think, that really threw Kaufman for a loop. And the clerk I spoke to talked about Kaufman musing with him in chambers about whether this was some sort of divine, karmic, everything coming back around. Was this accidental? Could this have been, is this a third order effect somehow from what had happened in the Rosenberg case? Was he being punished for this? This was not, you heard in that snippet about how Kaufman treated his clerks, he was not given to opening up and philosophizing with his law clerks. It's not the sort of thing he would have done. So he was not himself in this period, but because it had thrown him for such a loop and really devastated him, this is what the law clerk heard. I was kind of astonished to hear it. But eventually that came to a close, and he resumed his lifetime of defending the case and what he'd done.
And we talked about how tough he can be on law clerks. In 1985, his group of 3 law clerks included a U.S. District Court judge in the Central District of California, Michael Fitzgerald.
Yep.
and a former state court judge in San Diego and brilliant United States attorney down in the Southern District of California, Carol Lamb. So in the mid 80s, he is hiring women, Asian American women, and nearly driving them crazy.
Yeah. That never changed.
Yeah, I talked to Judge Fitzgerald, who said the three of them bonded together to survive.
Yeah.
But that he would routinely fire the law clerks in early October after they started.
Yeah.
You didn't get to experience any of that because he was quite ill by
I'm
then.
not sure
but-
get to is the right way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to, maybe.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you usually emerge from that clerkship with your best friend for life, who was your co-clerk, because you had both somehow survived it, if that person stuck it out with you. You're right that Kaufman would commonly fire clerks. The way I used to hear it was, he'd fire you. And of course, that's terrible, right? It's such a blot on your career, and you've been, it's job right out of law school. You've been fired by this judge. How are you ever going to explain that to the world? It's terrible. For a few hours, it's terrible. And then by dinner time, you're kind of like, well, God, at least I don't ever have to go back there again. Like I never have to see that SOB again. So I think by 9 p.m. you're sort of at peace with it. And then you go to sleep, and then the phone rings in the morning, and it's the judge. And the judge is like, "Where? Get in here. Where are you?"
Never happened.
Right.
What are you talking about?
And you're like, "Judge, you fired me." He's like, "No, I didn't get in here. What are you talking about? Get in here." So some of the firings stuck. Some of them he took back. Sometimes what would typically happen is he'd fire somebody. If the guy didn't come back, he'd call Paul Weiss, and he'd call Rifkin, or he'd call some of his other clerks. A lot of his clerks went to Paul Weiss. So he'd call Paul Weiss and he'd say, "Send me over, one of your new lawyers. He'll be a replacement clerk." And of course, the senior lawyers there didn't have the heart to sentence someone to this. So before that happened, sometimes that did happen, but before it went through, they would call the fired clerk, and they'd say, "Look, come on, he didn't really mean to fire you. You can go back. It's not that bad. He just exploded." So it was always this kind of mix of stuff. The only time it changed, the only really strikingly different thing that happened was in the 84, sort of the early 80s, before, I think, either right before or right after Fitzgerald clerked. All of his clerks quit at once. All three of them quit together. And that had never happened before. And of course, that was mortifying. And that actually made the National Law Journal, in addition to the New York Bar. So that was horribly embarrassing to him. And he did one of them he did actually like. And one of them he kind of begged to come back. And the guy did come back. And he said, Kaufman was better after that. And he had said, like, we didn't really mean to quit. We were just trying to get his attention. But then as soon as we said we quit, he said, "You're fired." And then we had to leave. And, so the plan had kind of gone awry a little bit. But usually it was tough. I fortunately, my co-clerk and I didn't see much of that. She was there a few months before I was, and she saw more of it because she was alone for a couple of months. But I saw very little of that.
Well, I want you to know that after I finished the book, I gave it to Judge Kuhnauer, and he loved the book because he said, "I don't look so bad next to this guy."
Right. Well, I did. I had a presentation in front of some judges in the Southern District of New York and Second Circuit a while ago. And I said, for judges, and if any judges here, you aside, of course, this would not be relevant to you, but, be nice to your law clerks, because one of them is going to write your biography, So Kaufman did not think in those terms.
Well, Martin, we could go on for another hour and a half, and we didn't even get to half the issues that we had on the table, but I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia for final thoughts, and then we'll give the author a nice round of applause after that.
Thank you, Judge Lasnik. We have like a minute. I wanted to make sure if there were some questions, we can entertain one now, and then just another housekeeping item. We have a wine and cheese reception on the first floor in the jury assembly room, and the author will join us there, as will Judge Lasnik, and those questions can be answered. But does anyone have a burning question before we? Yes, please.
So back in the 50s, was ineffective assistance of counsel a thing? And was that raised on behalf of prisoners?
No, I mean, that's a habeas thing. So the Rosenbergs were represented by the same lawyers who represented them at trial right up into the end. So they weren't admitting their own incompetence. And, you know, usually ineffective assistance is you're convicted, you're incarcerated, and then you get new lawyers who then go through the habeas process, right, and say the first lawyers were ineffective. So the Rosenbergs never really, I guess they could have tried that in the time when they were alive before execution. They stuck with their lawyers, and they did feel, I mean, I think they felt loyalty to their lawyers who had stepped up to represent them. And the lawyers very much felt, you know, stricken with guilt over the impending outcome of the case. And the Rosenbergs wrote letters to each other from prison that were later published. Some of those letters are to their lawyers, the Blocks. And you see, you know, the feeling they had toward the Blocks in those letters. So that dynamic of them recognizing that maybe this, you know, we didn't get the best representation, and that's a way to approach our, you know, where we stand now, didn't occur. And I'm not enough of an expert or historian on habeas to know how I think of that as a more recent development in you know, criminal review, but
Strickland was later.
Yeah, and Strickland comes
Yeah.
along in the 70s, right? So yeah, no, that never came up.
Cynthia, let me just do one thing real quickly, if I could, as a point of personal privilege for Jewish American Heritage Month. My mother's mother, my grandmother on my mother's side, who I never got to meet, was Ida Malasoff. And she passed away in childbirth with my mother's younger brothers. But her brother, William Malasoff, was a cherished uncle who treated my mother so well when she was a child who had lost her mom. And when my older brother, Billy, was born, he was named after William Malasoff in 1947. And William Malasoff was a brilliant scientist who, you know, was with Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein. I mean, an absolutely brilliant scientist. When the Venona files came out, it was revealed that William Malasoff was a Soviet spy who was sending secrets back to the Soviet Union. He died in 1947, so he was never actually confronted or charged with anything. But his two daughters, Vera and Ida Malasoff, who became physicians, were visited on an annual basis by FBI agents to make sure that they did not turn out to be communists. And they never fully understood why until the Venona papers were revealed.
It's incredible.
Much later. So the Rosenberg situation was not the only thing going on among people in those days.
Right. No, of course. And part of the outrage, I think, about the case and about the sentences is that there were so many others who were convicted or pled guilty or never were brought to justice at all. And the only ones to get the ultimate punishment were two whose role in the overall scheme of providing important information to the Soviets, you know, wasn't as serious as that of others.
And your point about ineffective assistance counsel also applies to Brady material. That was not easy to get government files that might have helped the Rosenbergs that existed in the Venona project, because that was top secret and was not shared.
The key component was it's called an implosion lens. And this junior member of the Rosenberg team said, we thought it was a camera. You know, we didn't know what a lens was. We thought a lens, this reference to the implosion lens was to a camera. They were so out of their league, and, you know, through no fault of theirs, really.
Well, on that note, we will keep the conversation going. Please come have a glass of wine with us and enjoy our reception. But first, before we thank the author, thank our master moderator, Judge Lasnik. And of course, one more round of applause for Martin Siegel. Thank you, Martin. And with that, we're adjourned. We'll see you in the jury assembly room.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope so. I hope people found it interesting. Yeah. Great. Thank you. I hope so.
Really
Thanks. Let me take this. Thanks.
How did it go? Yes,
It
Andrea.
went great. I wasn't
Wonderful.
sure. I have to tell you that your remark about Robert being a lost name.
Yeah.
So I was born in Hungary in
Oh.
1956.
Uh-huh.
My parents are Holocaust survivors. Guess what my father's name is?
Robert. Well, I'm doing a reunion with my Staten Island friends later this month. 5 of us were getting together from 4th grade. We've known each other. 4 of the 5 are named Robert.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, and 3 of them are Jewish too. Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure his parents weren't trying to give him a last
No,
name.
I'm
but-
sure not. Yeah.
Anyway, but you know, you never see kids named Robert anymore.
No, my wife's taught kindergarten, and for 10 years she had 1 Robert. Yeah. You know, whereas names like Michael or Matthew or just keep coming
I
around.
think it'll come back.
I think so too.
You
Yeah.
know, these things go on.
They do go in
cycles.
cycles.
Anyway,
Thanks,
you
Andrea.
For moderating. this.
Appreciate
This is
it. Yeah.
Fabulous. It's really good.
David Heller, we met.
Oh, yeah,
public a number
sure.
of meetings.
Yeah.
I had a summary judgment in front of you when you were still in the Superior Court.
Ah,
I won. So
Yay.
you must have gotten the right ruling.
thanks.
Thank you.
I bet he looks at me, but you're
That's hilarious. Oh my God, what that must have been.
Oh my God, it was so much fun.